Hi, we're ready to read chapter 20 of A Day of Rest by Edna Creekmore Carman. And here's the picture that goes with that chapter. Here we go. The black square shape of the two-story house stood out distinctly in the moonlight. A yellow glow of an oil lamp on the kitchen table cast a feeble light through the bare kitchen window into the gloom of the back porch. Two men sat at the kitchen table eating. "That's a shed there for their plows," Jas pointed in the direction of a low building. "That's the pig pen with the chicken house beyond. The only two buildings with doors that shut are the chicken house and the barn. The barn has a shed that has a door, but I've never seen it shut. They keep the wagon in that shed." They couldn't use the hen house to hide the boys, as Mrs. Barton might go there to look for eggs, so I think they would most likely use the shed that has the wagon. "You keep watch and I'll check it. Let out a whistle if you see Ed or Slim come to the back door. Uncle Doug, you be the watch and let me do the poking around. I've wandered all over these mountains. No one is going to be surprised to see me on this property. Just last week I was back here with Spot. He'd chased a rabbit until it went into a hole under the Bartons' barn. The Bartons just tongue-lashed me for making noise as I yelled at Spot. What about their dogs? Will they raise a fuss? I don't think so. Slim has teased them, so I think they will just run and hide. Okay, Jas, you check the barn. If you find Bert, come back. If we need help, we can get your dad or Al. They should be home from church soon." As Jas scampered toward the barn, Doug looked at the lighted window. Could he be mistaken? Could Bert and Jim be inside the house? No, he shook his head. Mrs. Barton would never stand for it. The boys would be outside, and probably in the barn. Jas was only a dark blur scampering across the road, but a long-legged shadow running across the open space distinctly showed where he was. The long-legged shadow vanished at the open door of the shed. The men in the kitchen seemed to have finished their supper. Slim rose from the table and walked toward the back door. Doug raised two fingers to his lips, ready to whistle Jas back. However, Slim stopped at a cupboard beside the door and took a bottle off the shelf. He took a drink from the bottle before passing it to Ed. As Ed drank from the bottle, Slim sat down at the table again. He reached across the table for the bottle just as his brother brought it down from his mouth. Doug relaxed. No trouble there for a while. He looked back at the barn just as Jas ran out of the shed door. Jas came back only to the road before stopping and waving Doug forward. "Bert's in there tied up," Jas said excitedly as Doug came within hearing distance. "He was gagged, but I took the gag off. I couldn't get at the knots on his arms and legs. The rope is old and frayed, but it is so tangled I couldn't make any headway with it." "Bert was trying to tell me something," Jas continued as the two began running toward the barn. "Something about someone else. I guess it was that Jim Weaver you talked about, but I didn't wait to see. I just told him to wait and tell you." "All right, Jas, I'll see what it's all about." Doug spoke quietly as he came to the shed. "You stand here at the door and watch while I get Bert and Jim. The Bartons have finished their supper and are having a nightcap. Since it's straight from the bottle, they will probably pass out soon, but don't let them surprise us." As Jas took his stand at the door, Doug whispered to Bert and followed the direction of Bert's excited "Dad" to the post where he was tied. "Did Susan get home all right?" Bert whispered anxiously. "Yes, she's fine. Doug whispered back as he fumbled with the knots tying Bert's hands. She got her dress dirty. It'll wash. Be quiet now. We don't want to rouse the Bartons. Doug spoke as he reached into his pocket for his knife. As Jas had said, the ropes were old and frayed, and it was impossible to untie them in the dark. But only one swipe of the knife blade across the rotten threads was enough to free Bert's hands. Another swipe and the ropes tying his ankles to the post were cut. Now where's Jim? Over there. Bert led the way around the wagon to where Jim lay half under the wagon with his legs tied to the wheel. Doug quickly jerked the gag off and then cut the bonds that held the boy. He then began pushing both boys toward the open door. But Bert resisted. "No, Dad," he whispered. "Mrs. Barton." "What?" Doug gave Bert another push toward the door, but looked in the direction that Bert was pointing. "She's tied up too." Bert was half sobbing. "She was trying to untie me when they caught her. Slim hit her 3 times real hard and then tied her to that post." "The swine," Doug hissed through his teeth as he saw the tiny woman huddled down in the straw at the foot of a post. Doug's knife was in his hand, and it took only a moment to cut the ropes binding Mrs. Barton. Gently helping her to her feet, Doug suggested that she come along with them and go to her sister's house. "No," Mrs. Barton spoke violently. "I won't be run out of my house by nobody." "But Ed and Slim are drunk, or as near to it as makes no difference. There's no telling what they will do if they come out here and find Bert and Jim gone. And, ma'am, I'm not going to leave them. Just let me worry about the 2 skunks." "All right, ma'am," Doug agreed hesitantly. "But don't go back to the house, not until they're sober." Mrs. Barton pondered the question a moment. "You're probably right," she said as she sat down on the hay again. "I'll wait until Rob gets home. You wouldn't have a gun on you, would you?" "No, ma'am, I don't." "Then there ain't any chance that you will shoot them?" she asked hopefully. "No, ma'am. I just want to get Bert and Jim away. They haven't really been harmed. I couldn't go shooting Slim and Ed, but I do hate to leave you with them." Still undecided what to do about the woman, Doug asked, "Where's Rob?" "I don't know. He left with Slim and Ed, but he didn't come back with them." "Then you don't know how long it will be before he gets back. You might be here all alone with Slim and Ed for some time. Let me take you over to Albert McKay's or to Ralph McRayler's house. I believe Ralph is your niece's husband. He lives just up the road, and I am sure either would welcome you." "No," Mrs. Barton rejected the idea. "I don't want to cause any trouble for Ralph or Al. Anyway, it's church night, and I saw Al and his family leave for church before Slim and Ed got back. And I'm not going to let a couple of drunken idiots run me out of my house. I'll just sleep here on the hay. Even the rats are kinder than those 2 animals." As she spoke, Mrs. Barton picked up the rope which had dropped on the hay and tied it loosely around her waist. Doug looked doubtfully at the tiny woman as she lay back on the hay and pulled a dirty horse blanket over herself. He wondered if he should pick her up and carry her off against her will. "Uncle Doug?" Jas's voice broke the silence. "Uncle Doug, they're standing up now." That settled it. If Ed and Slim were up moving about, he couldn't carry the woman off against her will. It would be best to take the boys home and get the milking done. Then he could go to Ralph and suggest that he come for Mrs. Barton. "We'd better be going, ma'am. I'd appreciate it if you don't tell Slim or Ed that Jas and I were here. It would only cause trouble." "Trouble is all I expect out of life," Mrs. Barton muttered. "But don't worry, I won't tell them nothing. Just say that Bert got loose and then Jim got loose." Doug nodded. "Evening, ma'am," and touched his hand to his hat before pushing Bert and Jim ahead of himself out of the shed. From shadow to shadow the 4 ran until they reached the woods. Then, with Jas in the lead, they stumbled back through the forest to the hillside meadow. Tightly gripping Jim and Bert by the hand, Doug followed Jas as he set a fast pace into the fog. Blindly, the four stumbled down the meadow to the road and then along the road until they came to the car still being guarded by the patient Beagle. Doug opened the back door of the car and pushed Jim and Bert into the seat. "Uncle Doug?" Jas spoke as he stooped to pet his Beagle. "Yes, Jas." Doug answered automatically while walking around the car to get in the driver's seat. "You know Dad." "Yes, Jas, he's my brother. I've known him all my life." Doug could scarcely keep the annoyance out of his voice as he paused to look toward Jas. He was anxious to get home now that the boys were safe. Aunt Mary would have worried herself sick by that time. The cows would be in misery. He wasn't in the mood to discuss his brother. But he owed a lot to Jas, so he smothered his frustration and asked, "Yes, Jas, what is it?" "You know how he is about being his brother's keeper and all that? If we tell him about the Bartons, he will be down here tomorrow with his Bible trying to get them to repent. If they don't repent, he'll bring the matter up before the church board. The whole valley will hear about the kidnapping by then. I don't mind the gossip, but you know how Al is. He's liable to go over to the Bartons with a gun to drive Slim and Ed off the place. I know Al has a violent temper, but he's not so likely to do anything drastic after it's all over." "Yes, he is. He says you must always punish those who hurt one of yours." "But neither Bert or Jim is one of his. Bert is mine and Jim is a Weaver." Doug spoke firmly. "I know." Jas shook his head impatiently. "But Bert is a McTay. Al is a McTay. He will feel the Bartons have to be punished for an insult to the McTays." "They'll be punished all right. I'll see to that," Doug promised. "Al doesn't have to worry." "Slim and Ed would be punished," Doug added to himself. "Not only for what they did to Jim and Bert, but also for what they did to Mrs. Barton when she came to their aid." "No, Al don't have to worry," Doug said aloud. "They'll be punished." "But he will worry. He'll just make up some excuse and go over there. It might even end up with him shooting them or getting shot himself. He thinks the world would be better off without that kind of scum. Of course, the world would be better off, but Al wouldn't be better off sitting in jail for shooting them." "What do you want me to do then, Jas? If I don't tell Charles that you helped me rescue Bert, you know you're going to get a licking you won't forget for coming in this late on a church night." "I know that, but I figure I'm going to get it whatever excuse I give, 'cause you can't say you kept me out of church." "Well, no, but if I say you were with me, Charles will think you were with me all the time." "No, Uncle Doug, I don't want you to lie that way for me either." Jas shook his head impatiently. "Because he'd find out one way or another and whip me again for lying." Doug remembered that Ralph had seen Jas with the fishing rod and agreed that Charles likely would hear the truth in the long run. "I'll get a whipping as I see it no matter what I do," Jas said firmly, "and I'd as soon be slaughtered for a sheep as a lamb. So, if you will lend me your lantern, I think I'll go back and try again to catch that old catfish tonight." Doug shook his head doubtfully as he reached into the back seat and picked up the lantern. It seemed as if he should discourage Jas from deliberately prolonging his absence from home, but Jas was 14. A 14-year-old mountain boy was responsible for his own decisions. Doug handed the lantern over without a word of reproach and got into the car as Jas picked up his fishing rod. Then, remembering that Aunt Mary wanted someone to help with the canning, Doug leaned out of the window and told Jas to give the message to Charles. Jas nodded in agreement before he whistled to his dog to accompany him and began walking back down the road in the fog. And that's the end of chapter 20.